Mixdown Media Productions.
When you're one unbalanced piece of audio from losing your shit.
This is the Podcast Therapist.
Welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Therapist. I am your host, the Shan Man, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and a podcast producer. And today is the very first podcast post Super Bowl. Tom Brady now has 7 Super Bowl rings, which is pretty impressive for a guy who is 43, moves from one Super Bowl team, now has created another Super Bowl team. And, very impressive for a guy who continues to move forward. But this is not a sports podcast. This is a podcast that is helping other podcasters and content creators. And I think this episode is just for you and hoping to inspire you and maybe give you some ideas about your own podcast. I think it's very important to hear the journey of other podcasters who have seen success with their podcast. And that is why I want to invite you to listen to today's episode and introduce you to my 2 guests today. Today, I'll be speaking with Vishnu and Shankar Padmanabhan, and they are the creators of the Writer and Geek podcast out of India. This is a podcast that was inspired a few years back by these 2 brothers who wanted to create a podcast that shared knowledge based on their desire and their passion for our thirst of knowledge. They are self-described geeks. They are gentlemen who have said that they used to carry around encyclopedias and read the encyclopedia as children, and they decided to use their strengths to create this podcast, Writer and Geek. In today's episode, we will be covering not only the very beginning of their journey and where they started with that journey. Some of that journey had, included seeing some videos of myself on YouTube, some content that I had created for another content creator. It wasn't necessarily something that was on my own channel. It was something that Vishnu ended up discovering and ended up following me on YouTube. But he describes how those very first videos that I had created on YouTube had helped inspire him to create and build this podcast from the ground up. So we'll be talking a little bit about what equipment he had purchased. I'm sure you know which equipment he purchased, but the process of how he decided that getting this equipment was going to be detrimental to the creation of his podcast. We're also going to talk about the software that they use. You would be surprised at what software that they're going to be using. And of course, you're going to learn how to focus your content and build your skills. They tell a story about how you can maintain your credibility and what you can do and how you can gain some ideas and inspiration from these 2 creators that create thoughtful content. And of course, there is this one thing that Shankar brings up in the interview today about overcoming the sound of his own voice and what it has actually done and how it has stepped him up into the next level of his own life and what you can do to personally gain from podcasting. We'll discover what these 2 content creators have personally gained from podcasting itself. And I think you will discover that their story is going to be very similar to your story if you decide that you want to push through some of the harder times of podcasting, when you don't feel inspired, when you don't feel as though the content is good enough. These 2 individuals hopefully will give you a little bit of inspiration, and they may even awaken. I don't know, maybe they'll arouse you, prompt you, motivate you, whatever the word is. They may prompt you to achieve or set a new goal to become the trailblazer within your own podcasting niche, so that you can inspire other podcasters or other content creators to put more knowledge and good into the world itself. I think that is one of the cool things about podcasting, is that you can create a podcast and inspire others to take an action, whether it is starting a podcast themselves or to take an action outside of podcasting and make a difference in the world. So these 2 content creators, I think, are very important in terms of just getting started. So we're going to talk with Vishnu and Shankar here very shortly. Stick around.
The Podcast Therapist.
Right now, you might be in the middle of the research phase of launching your podcast. Maybe you've gotten some equipment, signed up for a Zoom account, and have recorded a few podcast episodes. But what steps do you need to take when it comes to a successful podcast launch? Would you believe the biggest mistake podcasters make is the launch sequence? Seriously, just like a space shuttle has a sequence to put astronauts into space, podcasts have sequences to put a podcast in the marketplace successfully. That's why I created the podcast launch checklist. After helping numerous clients build their podcasts, I developed a step-by-step guide to help podcast creators just like you have a clean launch sequence without wasting time. The podcast launch checklist is a 12-step sequence that walks you through the pre-launch, mid-launch, and post-launch process with specific steps and instructions that will save you time. If you're tired of walking around in the dark trying to figure out everything that comes with a podcast launch, you can grab the podcast launch checklist today. Visit thepodcasttherapist.com/PLC and use the code PODTherapist, all one word, to get 25% off this checklist today.
Mixdown. It's time for the Mixdown. The Podcast Therapist.
I want to introduce to you today Shankar and Vishnu. I actually should say Vishnu and then Shankar. Nothing against you, Shankar, but Vishnu was the one that I had met the first time. They are the creators of the Writer and Geek podcast. They are the leading independent documentary podcast in India. They've been featured by the Bangalore Mirror, and also the Hindu and many other areas. Shankar and Vishnu, how you guys doing? Thanks for joining me on the Podcast Therapist.
Hey, thank you for having us. It's our pleasure to be here,
Absolutely, and that too in this festive season, it cannot get better than this.
Yeah. So we're recording this just about a week out before Christmas. And you guys, before we were recording, you were saying that in India, Christmas, the holiday itself is a pretty big deal, right?
Absolutely, especially we come from southern part of India, from a state called Kerala. Mm-hmm. It's called God's own country for its beauty and all the other stuff. And their Christmas is one of the biggest celebrations. It's like the whole state goes on celebration, and people just have party throughout the month.
The parties through the month.
Yeah.
What happens like on New Year's Eve? Do you guys even party on New Year's Eve and then throughout, or what's the story there?
I mean, usually people don't remember what happens on New Year's Eve because that is one of the most alcohol consuming states in India, and that is a time when people actually consume it's a record sales that happens during the month of December.
And I think I should add that the definition of party here and there, I think it's different. Here it's mostly eating and drinking, just sitting and eating and drinking.
And mostly not remembering what happened.
Well, I think it's kind of similar here. I just take out the eating part and just keep the drinking. I think it'd be pretty similar there, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I am so happy to have you guys here. And before we get started, I want to let everyone know that we are recording this particular podcast on video via StreamYard. And of course, you can create your own seamless recordings of your podcast interviews or stream them live to multiple platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, LinkedIn, or Periscope. You can learn more about StreamYard through my affiliate link at thepodcasttherapist.com/StreamYard. Now, I brought you guys on today because you have had this podcast, I think it's been about 3 years that you have had this podcast. Has it been longer since you've had the Writer and Geek podcast?
Yeah, I think it should be around 3.5 years now. We started mid of 2017, and I think we are in December of 2020, right? So it should be 3.5 years.
Okay, and so I want to walk the audience through the process and really kind of the genesis of where this idea of Writer and Geek came from. So first of all, tell us what the Writer and Geek podcast is all about, and then we can expand from there.
To explain the genesis of Writer and Geek, right, I might have to go back about maybe 25 years back to our childhood, right? Both of us were these, tiny geeks, I would say, interested in topics of science and astronomy, and space and all that kind of stuff. So we used to have, we had a encyclopedia at home, which our dad had bought many years ago when we were kids. So when we started reading it, we got fascinated by all these topics. And we used to have these conversations late night, sitting in our house, about spaceships and all that kind of stuff, right? So that interest was always there. And then fast forward to somewhere around 2012, I think. That is when I was introduced to the world of podcasting. By accident, I must say. I was working as a software engineer. I was a developer for a company, and I was trying to find a solution for one of the problems which was bothering me. And while doing some Google search, I came across something which was called a podcast, and there are two computer geeks sitting and talking about some of the stuff that really fascinated me. For one of the reasons is that since I was a kid, I always wanted to be on radio, or maybe have my private radio station or something like that, but that never happened.
Right.
So when I saw these guys sitting and talking on internet, and it's like a streaming radio kind of a thing, I was really fascinated. I didn't know anything about it. I went deeper and deeper trying to understand what is this all about. Then I realized that there is a plethora of lot of other topics on which there are different number of podcasters around the world making shows and stuff like that. And I think at that time there were very, very less shows coming out from India. Mostly I used to listen to European and American shows. Slowly I got into listening. I was listening to a lot of shows. Then one day I thought probably, it might be a good time to try and do something of my own. But frankly speaking, I didn't know what to make a podcast on. So maybe 2-3 episodes, I started speaking about some, self-improvement kind of thing, which kind of didn't work out. And I didn't even publish those, episodes. I just threw them away. Shankar, I think at this time was not even exposed to podcasts. Neither was he interested. It got revived back in 2016, late 2016, when I again thought, probably this is the time. And that is when I was going through multiple videos on YouTube. That is where I came across one of your videos. I think it was an interview by a different company.
AWeber.
It was not
probably AWeber.
Yeah. It was not on your channel, but I came across that video, and through that I got introduced to your channel, and that is where I was like, okay, you know what, probably this is doable. Again, didn't have an idea about what to talk about or what the show should be about or what it should be called or whatever it is. I discussed it with Shankar, I think, one day. Then we thought, see, we used to have these conversations, right? Like these geeky conversations about science and technology, history and all that. Why don't we make a show about it? Because in my experience, what I've realized is a lot of people know a lot of things, and it's surprising how much they don't know as well, right?
Right.
So we thought we will craft a show across this concept where we introduce a topic, give a high-level idea about what and how and all that kind of stuff, not being experts in it, but in the process learn ourselves, which sparks the curiosity of a listener, and then he can take it from there. If he is interested in astronomy, we will introduce you to it. You go and do your own research, and you can go deeper into it. So that is where this whole Writer and Geek thing started back in 2017.
Shankar,
I will let Shankar add something.
Yeah,
I think he has something to say.
Yeah, my story is completely different. Yeah, whatever he said about 25 years ago, reading the encyclopedia, that's all the same. But yeah, I'm this kind of a person who is actually comfortable singing in front of people than talking like this. Okay, so I used to be that kind of a person, and I was not at all interested in listening to podcasts and stuff. So the thing is, like, you won't believe it, I started listening to podcasts on a regular basis last year.
Really?
Like 2 years into having my own podcast. So the thing was, like, Vishnu came up to me, like, he said he started a podcast. I think that was in 2015, 14.
Yeah, end of 2014.
Yeah, so that's where I was exposed to podcasts for the first time. I didn't even know such a thing existed, and then that didn't work out for him.
Mm-hmm.
Then when he came to me in I think Jan of 2017, he said that we'll start a podcast. Anyway, we talk about a lot of stuff. Let's just record it and put it out there. I was actually very reluctant. I was like, you know what? I don't think I'm ready. I'm up to it.
Right.
It won't work out. But then after a little bit persuasion, we worked on it for like probably 3-4 months. And we recorded a few episodes, released it. I was still not comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing was, like, I never used to listen to a podcast earlier. I used to hate my voice. And whenever we used to record, I used to make him edit it. So that's the kind of aversion I had with creating a podcast. But over time, I think it has improved. We still got a lot to improve, when it comes to production of podcasts and all that. But right now, I think we are at a stage where, it's probably something we expect to, blossom and turn into something in the future. So my story was like, I was never interested in podcasting. But then because of Vishnu, I got introduced to it. And reluctantly, I joined it, and somehow it worked out.
Well, that's good. I love that you have now embraced the idea of podcasting to share your ideas out. Now, before we move into that next step, like I want to ask this question that about you listening to podcasts just within the last year or so. What was your impression after doing your own podcast? What was your impression of listening to other people's podcasts? And how did that impact maybe what you decided to do on your own podcast?
Okay, so the thing was I was more into listening to music. I can just go on listening to music forever. But the thing was when I got introduced to podcasts, I was introduced to podcasts which were very mainstream, which never resonated with me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only last year that I got to know that there are true crime podcasts or a little bit of creepypasta kind of podcasts.
Right.
And that's when I started listening to it. I think I started with Serial, but then I moved on. And it just hit me, there is a lot of knowledge out there. And then I was introduced to Wondery and Parcast and all those other networks. And I came across some interesting podcasts, which was very well produced and had a lot of knowledge in it. After listening to podcasts continuously for the past year, right? It's very easy for me to have a conversation with a stranger. If someone approaches me and we talk about something, it's very easy for me to just control where the conversation goes, and I can talk about anything. That's what I gained from podcasts. Whatever podcast I listen to, it's all basically either true crime or knowledge based now.
Right.
So what did I implement from what I heard to Writer and Geek? Right. So a lot of things that influenced me is one thing is when I heard this podcast called 1865, right? That's when I realized, how production matters. That is one of the podcasts which is so well produced. And that's when we talked about it. And I talked to Vishnu about, we should ramp up the production quality. And we started with the series called Colonialism in India. Mm-hmm. So it's an ongoing series which already has 11 episodes. And I thought we'll introduce some voiceover work. So earlier it used to be we'll just sit and talk about a topic, and that's it. It's done. We edit it and put it out. But then with this series, we started adding a little bit of voiceover so that we can improve the production quality. There'll be a storyline kind of thing which will enhance the listening experience.
Sure.
So that is the thing that has, that's something which I added to our podcast from whatever experience I had listening to other podcasts.
Okay.
Yeah, if I may add to it, so especially with this colonialism series, right? India has a very dynamic history with colonialism, where we had multiple visitors from Europe, including the Britishers, from whom we got independence late 1940s, right? So that is a very colorful picture, right? Just sitting and rambling about it might probably not interest a listener.
Mm-hmm.
So what we thought was, if we start the narrative with a perspective, it could be maybe a soldier who is going on war or a battle or something. You start from his perspective. That kind of paints a picture for the listener, right? And I feel that the power of visualization is what it's amazing, right?
Right.
So when we listen to 1865, which is about the events that followed after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, we thought, that when you listen to that podcast, you can virtually see the actors in your mind, right? Actors, or I would say the characters, rather. So we thought we didn't do the entire series that way, because our show is probably not in that. We are not producing it that way, or we don't have the capability to do that. But we thought maybe a 2-minute intro into a story, starting it maybe in the field where there's a battle going on, or anything, trade is happening all around. Add some sound effects which makes you feel that you are in that medieval period of trade happening in India, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes the listener more interested. It pulls them in. Then you start your story, and it makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
So, and listening to the feedback that came across about the series, I think that worked as well. People always like to see and hear something new. So that is why we thought, that was kind of a level up that we did in the last year during this pandemic that came in.
Right. So let's start. Like, I want to continue and start moving towards this, building the podcast out and starting from episode 1. Shankar, you had mentioned in those first episodes that you were pretty nervous, reluctant, whatever it may have been, however you want to describe it. But clearly there was this desire to continue to keep moving. Maybe that desire or that motivation came from your brother. But let's talk first about the process of getting the podcast up and running, because I know that we see, especially I see on my YouTube channel, it happens every single day. Someone is asking a question about, well, what should I get as far as equipment is concerned? And then they either overthink it or they underthink it too much, and then they just want to jump into the content, which I have no problem with them jumping into the content, but they want it to sound a certain way. So talk to me about that first step when it came down to getting the equipment, and then I want to talk about the structure of how we started developing your own style. So who was the person that started with the equipment?
I think I was the one who got us started with the equipment. So I am kind of this overthinking gear snob kind of a person.
Just wait a second.
I think our dog is barking. Give me a second.
Right back.
Oh, it's okay.
As I was saying, right, I am this person who is a gear snob and someone who kind of overthinks everything. So before I started podcast, as I said, right, when I saw your video, and I was paying attention to what kind of mics people are using and what mixing software you're using. I think somewhere you mentioned about using Yamaha MG10XU, which is a mixing board that you use for mixing your podcast and stuff like that, right? So along with understanding how to structure a podcast and launch stuff and all that, I was also thinking about what are the different infrastructure stuff that you need behind the scenes.
Right.
So for me, I kind of didn't overthink too much, but I was like, if I'm starting, I need a proper setup, because the first podcast which I recorded, I remember I used an iPad. So you can imagine what quality it might have been. Anyway, I didn't publish it, so I had to throw it away. But when we came to launching Writer and Geek, I had decided that it should at least sound good, right? Maybe not as good as some of the podcasts out there. So I went and purchased a condenser mic, which in the hindsight probably wouldn't have been an ideal choice for the environment that we had. We have a little noisy environment here, right? So condenser mic catches a lot of those noises.
Right.
And we were two of us. So having one mic usually doesn't cut it. So when we launched the podcast for the first 4 episodes, I think we used just one Samsung Meteor condenser mic and the laptop directly plugged into USB. And for mixing, since beginning, we have been using Audacity, and that's how it started off. But almost 3-4 episodes in, I was not happy with it. And I'm sorry to say, but I'm somewhere this perfectionist kind of a thing where I want, everything to sound really good, like radio and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
So that's where I thought, anyway, maybe investing into more gear is going to keep us motivated and, make sure that we continue this process. Yeah, initially it was a big struggle to keep ourselves motivated, but I think we both balanced each other out where, whenever I feel down, he's like, hey, we got to publish something this week. We have a commitment. Or when he feels down, I do it,
Right.
the other way. So after about 5 episodes, when I decided I need to upgrade my gear, I had one of my friends who was visiting US at the time. So I ordered a couple of USB XLR mics, which are the ones you're seeing right now.
Are those which ones are those? Are those the ATR 2100s?
Yeah, they are very similar to the ATR 2100s, but these were made by a company called Knox, which I feel is a knockout version of ATR 2100 because this company doesn't exist anymore,
Right.
and these mics are completely out of production. But the internal build structure, if I open it up, it's exactly same as 2100. I don't know, if they had a copyright infringement or something like that, but the company doesn't exist. But I got these for really good deals. They were about $39 each.
Right.
Really cheap, but really good quality. I mean, you get ATR 2100 kind of quality from this. So I got them shipped to India. Then I invested in MG10XU just because you were using it.
You're using the Yamaha MG10XU because of me. I mean, hey,
Yes.
I mean, Flattering.
Honestly, that is the only reason I bought it. I was like, hey, if that is working for him, I mean, it might be more than enough for me.
Right.
I actually remember him ordering it, and it came home like I think a week later. And I was like, do we even need this? Because when he ordered it, I didn't know what it actually is. And I saw this and I'm like, why? Why?
But in hindsight, it has been kind of useful because he does a little bit of music recording and all that. This thing is a multi-purpose beast. So I don't regret. I think that is the best purchase that we had with respect to podcasting gear.
Yeah.
When you mentioned that we should get a mixer or something, the first thing that I suggested was, we'll go for like Focusrite Scarlett 2i2 or something. And when I heard your podcast, I think it was the second episode, you said that it's better to invest long term and get a MG10XU or a Rodecaster or like a Focusrite. I was like, okay, it's good that Vishnu did it.
Right. So those questions, in my first episode, I think it was, these utility episodes for people who first come in contact with my podcast. I'll talk about those pieces of equipment. I've recorded on the Focusrite 2i2s, and I've seen people who are running, these businesses, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to use the Focusrite, and it's based on preference. But when someone says to me, I want to do this with my Focusrite, can I do this? And it's like, no, you can't. You have to move forward as opposed to staying stuck within the same pieces of equipment. So when I recommended the MG10XU in a lot of my videos and in my podcast, it is just the midline piece of equipment. You could go to the Procaster, which is an additional $300 more than what this is, and does almost exactly the same thing, other than it's just a little fancier. So that long-term game, like you said, Shankar, that's what I really want podcasters to focus on, is that you buy the equipment. Yeah, it may cost a little bit in the beginning, but it's a long-term investment. You're going to get so much usage out of it.
Right. I totally agree with you that it's all about preference, right? If you look at the audiophile industry, where people invest so much into turntables and CD, and they argue about Spotify streaming quality, as compared to Tidal and all that kind of stuff. I feel that, yeah, you can sit and argue about all this equipment and what is the best sounding thing. Some people say that Scarlett sounds much, much better than MG10XU, but it's all in the context of what you feel is the best for you, right?
Right.
And beyond a point, it's not even worth discussing, right? So you improve something, how much are you going to improve it, and what is the return on investment?
Mm-hmm.
So that diminishing returns, there is a curve that goes down, right? You invest more and more. At some point of time, it stops just giving you returns,
right?
So I feel that of all the purchases, Yamaha MG10XU has been the best. It's not very expensive, it's affordable, but it does a lot more for what you pay for it.
Right.
So I feel that is one of our best purchases. But I think that is where we peaked and plateaued, and we decided that what we need to focus is not on the equipment. Probably we should be focusing more on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Try to understand mixing and maybe a little bit of audio editing and all that kind of stuff. So we focused, and that is still a work in progress. And one thing I want to put out for if anyone is deciding to start a podcast, right? Don't overthink stuff. You can start with a good set of lavalier mics, which are not that expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Plug it directly into your computer and learn a little bit of maybe free software like Audacity to get you started, right?
Right.
As you see traction and as you see that you are more invested into your podcast and you want to take it to the next level, you can always invest more. And more than anything, the content matters. The way you tell your story matters. How it connects with your listeners matters, right?
Right.
That should be the focus, at least for the first half year or a year when you start, not the gear.
Right.
That's what I think. Yeah.
That's what I think. And I hate to even sound like I'm talking bad about these guys, because I do see them all over the place. A lot of them are my friends. A lot of them are acquaintances in the industry here in the United States. But, sometimes, and you touched on this a little bit, sometimes people just focus way too much on the equipment. And it's like, look, you can only do so much with the equipment. The equipment's not going to make the thing that is going to be the thing that really takes you to the top. It's the tool. And so I always say the tool is only as good as the person who's using the tool. And so if you're using the tool to whatever capacity that it is, I mean, you could, on this mixing board, I don't know if you've had a chance to play with the sound effects of the mixing board, but the sound effects alone are just another tool that I'm able to use within my production sounds that you hear within my podcast drops or dumps or sweepers or anything like that. So I have to remind podcasters that you can go so far with the technology, but you're going to reach a point to where you're going to have to say, all right, forgive me for saying this, but you got to get shit or get off the pot and start building content. So,
right.
Well, you had something to say, Shankar.
Yeah, it's simple, right? You give a $50 guitar to Adam Jones and ask him to play it, and versus you playing a $1,500 Stratocaster, which is going to sound better.
Right.
It's obviously the experience that matters, right?
Right.
So that's it's as simple as actually. And even if you look at your journey, right, you were using if I remember right, you were using a Yeti, right?
Yeah.
Blue Yeti was what you were using for past maybe many years. Now you upgraded to a Shure SM7B.
Right. Yeah.
After churning out so much useful content, which people found really useful, and you have built a brand on that cheaper microphone already.
Mm-hmm. That
is when you decide, okay, now probably it's a time for an upgrade, and that makes more sense.
Right. It's just you just got to move in steps, and I try to relate it or try to give this example of it's like anything that you really do. I mean, you could relate this to exercise, you could relate this to starting a new job, you could relate this to overeating, where you eat and then you're just like, then you just eating a little bit more and you eat a little bit more. Well, yeah, eventually you are gaining something. It's weight, but you are gaining something, right? Over short-term gains. But it goes with anything. You have to start small, and then in order to reach another level, let's look at it on the positive side, like an exercise routine. You could maybe even just jog for 10 minutes, but what about a month from now? You might be jogging 20 minutes a month from now if you just kept with that particular routine. So I agree, staying small and sticking small and then upgrading as you go along. And in your guys's journey, when you transitioned from the technology side, how did you start developing the content? Can we walk through that process of where does a piece of content start? Where does the idea start? And walk me through how you go from beginning to production to end.
Yeah, so we had no idea where to start when we started, to be honest.
Okay.
If you look at our first episode, I think it was about
social media.
Social media is the second one. We did on formal education, right? Yeah. So, and it's all over the place. If you look at the first 35 episodes, it's like all over the place. Like, I remember back in 2017, May or something, we sat down and we noted down like some 50 topics, which we could research and talk about. And we might have done around like 5 out of it, right? Yeah. That's all we have done. So we didn't have a proper structure when we started out. So most of the people, they have this issue saying that, I don't know what to talk about, or like, I don't have the equipment. The thing is, like, you just have to put out content and figure it out on the way, because when you're just starting, you don't have an audience, and it's okay to make mistakes and learn from it. So you have a practical, experience of making mistakes and learning from that, rather than, trying to make everything perfect before you start. Because no matter what you do, how much effort you put in, you're going to make mistakes. So that's how we started. Like, we had no idea where to start, but we just started it. And over the course of time, we figured out, okay, our podcast is more towards, the documentary of stuff, and it's into history and things. So where do we get content from? So as we mentioned, the encyclopedia is one great source. So whatever we have read, whenever those, topics, we think about it, we're like, okay, we know about it, but we don't think like, most of the people know about it. So that's where we get most of the content from, and all over the internet. And also we had this Childcraft book, right?
Yeah. So we had, I spoke about this encyclopedia physical book, which we had, like, which our parents bought about 30 years ago. That has a lot of stuff, right? I mean, yes, world has moved on to like Wikipedia and YouTube Shorts, but those physical books, we still carry them around as we move around. There are like 30 volumes of A to Z kind of a thing, right? So that has a lot of topics which we used to read over and over again as kids, right? So it's like we don't put too much energy into trying to find what should be the topic for next episode. It's like randomly it happens, right? One of the episodes that we did was on toothbrush. We all use it every day.
I was just listening to that one before we. I have a question about that, but go ahead.
Yeah. So we kind of use toothbrush every day. Who really stops and thinks, hey, how did we start using it, right? What is the history behind this small piece of equipment that you use to clean your tooth every day in the morning? So those kind of questions come day in and day out when we are living our life, just going about it and all that. So yeah, I would say it is more of, then when such thoughts come in, you just note it down somewhere. Once in a week or something, we'll sit and discuss, hey, so what are the next episodes that we can plan? He will have some topics and I will have some topics. And the research mostly revolves around the person who is suggesting the topic. So the reason that we do that, if he is, okay, for example, serial killers is one of his favorite, topics for some reason. I don't know why. I don't want to go there. So yeah.
I don't know. I don't have a good feeling about you, Shankar. I mean, I kind of feel like after this call, you're going to murder me.
Exactly.
We have to record one today.
Yeah. So he usually is into those kind of stuff. So if he decides a topic, usually mostly I would say about 90 to 95% of research is done by the person who decides a topic. I would at the same time go and research about something else. The reason that we do that is when we come and sit down to record, the conversation seems more natural. And so all the exclamations and surprises and all that you hear throughout the conversation, it's all genuine. It's not that I know already about this and I'm just acting as though I'm surprised. It's not like that. I genuinely don't know about stuff which he is explaining. So that makes it feel like a coffee shop conversation kind of a thing, which is what most of our listeners kind of love. It is unscripted, to be honest.
Okay.
Honestly unscripted. It's not like we do have a bullet point list of things that we need to cover. That's all we have. But we then sit and talk about, stuff. That's why you might see us, diverging from the main content to something else and then going around and coming back. But that is what adds interest to the listeners as well. Some of them have said that, it's better you listen to them start beginning till end because you don't know what other stuff might come in between. So
right.
Yeah, that's the kind of feedback that we've got.
Yeah, I was wondering about like what that structure looked like when it came down to the development of the content. Like, do you guys sit down? Do you write out bullet points? Or do you script it out? And when I've heard your podcast, I'll sometimes sit over here and I won't be sitting. I'll actually be over there cooking in the kitchen, and I'll listen to the podcast, and then I'll be like, "Wow, this is just like listening to a conversation of two dudes who have a vested interest in the topic, and they know a little bit about it, but they're also looking to educate the listener as well. So you have the listener in mind also when you're developing the content. Is that what every podcaster should be trying to do when they develop a podcast?
Right. I'll let Shankar speak as well, but before that, I'll just add a point. So there is a problem when we, sometimes when we talk to people, we assume that they are at the same level as we are when it comes to certain topics, right? If I am trying to discuss something with Shankar, let's say, we are having a conversation, I should be sitting with an assumption that he probably doesn't know anything about it, right? So when we craft our episodes, we try to start from the basics, whatever it is. It could be a science episode. It could be about Indian history. Most of the Indians should know Indian history, but we assume that, okay, some of them might not. So we start from the basics. We tend to think about the questions that might come up in their minds, right? So we don't leave anything to assumptions thinking, oh, they should be knowing it. We don't need to cover it. We try to keep that in mind. Along with keeping it natural, as a flow of conversation. We are not very strict about, these are the exact, stuff that we should think about, and these are the exact words we should speak. No, we have a bullet point of, topics to cover. Take a glance at it. Okay, this is the next thing that we need to cover. Have a conversation around it. So initially, it was a bit difficult because translating these thoughts and putting them in words was a difficult thing for us to do because we were not experienced in this at all, and we are both truly introverted people. We like to meet people only through the internet or something.
Wait, you're telling me you guys are introverted? Oh, come on.
Nobody believes that. To be honest, I think even when we spoke to other people, we have had few interviews before. When we say that podcast, the reason that we are really interested in continuing our podcast and we put so much energy into it is because it's a way for us to open up, have conversations without literally having to meet someone.
So you would say you guys are ambiverts then. You're both a little bit of extrovert and some introvert.
Behind the camera and mic, we are extroverted, but in person we might not be. It depends on the person on the other side as well.
I think it takes time for us. Whenever a person reaches out to us to interview or something, we may come across as very arrogant and rude. But it's not because we are actually like that. It's because we don't want to have a conversation with a stranger,
Well, maybe what it is that they're getting the vibe that you, Shankar, are going to murder them because you have this vibe of the serial killer. No, I'm just teasing. I'm totally teasing. I'm teasing.
You never know.
No, I'm just kidding. No, I get it. I'm very much the same way. Everyone's like, "Oh, you're so outgoing." I'm like, "Man, you should see me at home." When I'm around friends, I'm just kind of like a little old hermit who just
yeah. And one other thing that I would like to add is that we don't overthink it. We are not like, hey, we have to be perfect with this. It should be like a science paper out of a university or something like that.
Yeah,
we are gonna make mistakes. We get feedback from people saying that, hey, the thing that you mentioned in last episode, it's not this, it's that. We accept it. We correct that in the next episode. So we don't take it too seriously. I mean, nobody should even take life too seriously is what I feel.
Whoa,
so so that I think that keeps the fun in it. The moment we start becoming too strict about stuff, I think you start losing interest.
So when we research, see, my idea is that you can not just survive on entertainment, and our podcast is not that entertaining too. It's more about the knowledge, right? So if you look at it, if you compare this to like music and lyrics, right, what attracts you to a particular audio, like a song, is the music, how it flows, the melody and stuff. But what it's kind of a lust kind of thing, but you fall in love with the song when the lyrics is good, right? Don't you think so? That's my philosophy. Like I may like a song just because it's catchy, but if it has to stay in my life forever, as an evergreen thing, which I go back and listen to it over and over again over time, it should have good lyrics. So our podcast is something which is little entertaining, but it also has that lyrical aspect, which is the content, the knowledge that you'll gain when you listen to it. So whenever we research on things, particularly this episode where we talked about Cyanide Mohan, a serial killer.
He uses cyanide to, kill people.
Yeah. So
I mean, let's be straight before you continue. Let's just be straight. The true crime podcasts that have that content, it is wildly fascinating to learn about those things. You're like, really? That guy used that to what? Anyway, continue. I don't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah. So when I was researching on that guy, the thing was like, it took me almost 3 weeks of research to get information about him. The thing was like, it's not a serial killer from the US, so he does not have any material on.
He was not a rock star status.
He did not have a rock star status like Ted Bundy or like Gary Ridgway. So I had to go through hundreds of articles, which were, most of them were not like what is that, mainstream media,
right?
So I had to like get more content on it and probably like cross check whether it's actually true what they're saying in this article. So it took me almost like 3 weeks of research, so that when a person listens to it, they know that okay, these guys have done the research and it's actually true. So we actually whatever we say, we try to give reference to it on the source, so that they know that it's actually whatever we are saying, it's not made up, it's all fact based.
Right.
So yeah, whenever we research, right, what we try to do is like it might be entertaining for some people, but I hope it is. And the content is the main thing. If a person listens to it, they'll gain some knowledge. That's what we try to make sure when we create a podcast.
Yeah, that is something that like I have learned when I've listened to your podcast. And it was a couple months ago I was listening to your podcast, and in fact there was a specific time, I can't even remember which episode it was, but I was cooking dinner, because that's my pastime. I'll cook dinner, listen to a podcast, and all I remember when I listened to your podcast was that I gained knowledge almost immediately from the moment that I was listening to it all the way to the end, and I felt fulfilled. And the payoff of your podcast gave me not only knowledge, but entertained me as well. And I was like, okay, these guys are on to something. They're on to doing this. And then I think that was around the time when you, Vishnu, you reached out to me. And I think you had said that's when the podcast was being featured on, or someone had reached out to you from one of the local newspapers, or I forget what it was. And they had said that they had found your podcast to be one of the best podcasts in India.
Yeah, I think that is exactly when we've got featured in one of the newspapers here. I think I cannot remember which one, but yeah, I think that was around the time.
Right.
And coming to the knowledge part, right? That is what really one of the motivating factors as well. At least for me, I have a lot of my friends and colleagues who listen to the show.
Mm-hmm.
They usually, before this all this world went upside down, they used to commute from home to office. They get about half an hour of journey, right? So they used to say, hey, half an hour episode of yours, I start from home, I start playing it. By the time I'm in office, it's done and I have learned something new.
Right.
And we stay in the state called Karnataka, in the city of Bangalore, which is not our home state. We come from Kerala, as I mentioned earlier. So in India, the special thing about different states is that each and every state has a different language, right? So you can imagine.
Yeah,
right.
The country is divided linguistically. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the thing.
The borders of the states are decided based on the language that you speak, right? So we come from a completely different background and language. And when we moved to Karnataka, it is a new language here called Kannada, which is a very old language, about 2,500 years old. One of the things that fascinated me was to learn about the history of Kannada, right? So while learning, we thought we'll do an episode, and we did one. We started a series called Languages. It's still, I would say it is still in progress, although we have published only one episode.
Mm-hmm.
So 2.5 years back.
Yeah, so we decided to take Kannada as the first language to discuss, and I did some research. It was really fascinating to me that to learn few of the things about the language. And when we published the episode, many native Kannada speakers from my office and my friends, and even otherwise, they came back saying that we have been speaking this language since the time that we were born. But yesterday, when I listened to your show, is when I got to know so many things about my own language.
Mm.
And this is not our native language. One of the things interesting for me was how in Greek plays from 5th century had a reference and Kannada language lines within their plays. That means there was a trade between the state and Greece back in those days. So those kind of astounding historical facts, right? That is what we try to find and, put it in our show so that, so people learn something about their culture and their society and all that kind of stuff.
Right. There's a podcast here in the States, specifically within my state. It's called Valley 101. It's actually within the city of Phoenix, Arizona. And there are things, it's a podcast that is very NPR-ish, but what they talk about is they'll talk about the history of a certain location in Arizona or the city, what a monument, what the history was behind that monument, and then they'll go further and deeper, and they'll examine some of the news articles that they have written over the years because it's all affiliated with a newspaper here in town. And so those are the things that like I thought, wow, I didn't realize that about this particular mansion, or I didn't realize this about this particular mountain. And I learned something, and the podcast seems to do really well. And I think that is where, when it comes to developing and creating content, is what can you do to educate someone to becoming, I guess, a little bit better every day. And so that's what I think you guys, that's why I really like to just, give you guys the kudos that you deserve for your program, because you do that so well with your listeners. I want to move into this area where we talk about what your podcast has done for you personally. What have you gained specifically out of your own podcast?
I'll let Shankar take it first,
so
and then I'll give my point.
First things first, I used to hate my voice, like not the singing voice, but the talking voice. But over time, I have come to come to a place where I'm like, okay, it doesn't sound that bad. It's okay. It's still okay.
Right.
And one important thing is that I've gained from podcasting over the years is that I can seriously hold on a conversation for how much ever longer I want. I can meet a stranger. I'll obviously have a starting trouble with them, but then once we get into the groove, right, I can easily just jump ships from topics to topics,
sure,
and just sit there and have a conversation for days. That is for sure. And what else is there? One major thing that we have gained is, like, I think when we started podcasting, we thought that we are the only ones who were doing this in India. Okay. Probably 6 months down the line, we got to know that there are other people who are doing the same thing in Bangalore, and which resulted in us having a virtual meetup online. And then a few months later, we met up in person, and which led to building a community. And we are part of O2 Pod Collective, right?
Yeah.
So right now, which started with like 3 podcasters just sitting together and having a conversation about what will happen in the field of podcasting over the years. Now we have around how many people in that community?
I think last meetup we had around 70 people from across.
Yeah.
How many?
Not just from 70.
70.
Wow.
70. Yeah. That's like the people who could make it.
And few of them had taken a 3-hour long flight to come over for the meetup.
Yeah.
Really? No. Okay. So
from
go ahead. Yeah.
70. Yeah. So from 3 to 70, we have a big community now, which is all about, helping each other. We are there for each other. Like whenever a new podcaster comes up and asks you a question on Instagram or like through email or something, it's a community that helps people,
Yeah.
So we get around, I get around almost like at least 2 requests over the week asking like what equipment should we use, what this thing. So we have like, a community which can help budding podcasters, mostly independent podcasters here in India, especially in Bangalore. So this community is one thing that, it's a community of like-minded people. If you look at it, all of them are introverts waiting to just find people who are of the same wavelength. So so it's a beautiful community that we have. So that's one thing I'd surely say that we have gained through this 3 years of podcasting.
Yeah, for me it has been both personal and otherwise as well. He was mentioning about community, so let me start with that. I used to always struggle to understand what is it that I can give back, right? When the whole thing about you are being held by so many different people around the community, knowingly and unknowingly, what am I even doing, right? I used to go to work, come back, eat, sleep, and then go to work again. So when we started podcasting is when we realized, I think we got an invitation from one of the top colleges in Bangalore to give a seminar.
I remember this. Yeah. I remember this.
So that is the first time I realized, you know what, I think we might have something to offer, to the society. It could be in the form of, training, giving trainings or seminars about podcasting. And that was the first thing we did. I think it was about not even 6 months, maybe 3 to 4 months after we started our show. And that really, we got a good response, and, students started coming up, and I was really fascinated. I was like, you know what, whatever happens, this is a great way to help people, especially young students who can build a portfolio even before they get out of college about the topics that they like, which might help them in future for their employment and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, and as he said, we built a community across, around podcasters, and I'm glad to say that some of the people we helped back in the day, around 2 to 3 years ago, there was someone who was celebrating his 100th episode recently, and I was like, you see the transformation in people, right? Where they were, and just starting out, not knowing how to get about it. I mean, we started, nobody told us how to do stuff. We just found on our own, but we wanted them to have someone to tell them how it's done, right? So that is one aspect of community, and that, as I said, we are introverts, so this is the only way that we get introduced to new people and
Sure.
find healthy relationships and stuff like that.
Sure.
The second aspect is for me as well, was it almost touches the first one. It's like networking and stuff like that. Even within the organization that I work for, it has helped me have really good conversation with the upper management. People who are really into podcasting. So beginning of this year, we had few visitors, a few managers coming down, directors and managers coming down from the US. We were just casually talking, and one of them was this hardcore NPR fan. He was a big fan of NPR and their podcast and all that. And I told him how we had, one of NPR's superheroes, Shankar Vedantam, who hosts Hidden Brain, come down to a coffee shop near our house, and we had a chat for about an hour. He was completely blown away. And that was such a sense of satisfaction for me, feeling that people whom many of them consider to be rock stars, they are sparing some time to come down and speak and sit and have a conversation.
Yeah.
It was the first time we met someone on Wikipedia who has a page on
Yes,
Wikipedia.
exactly.
In real life.
Not made by himself.
You're like mind blown.
So that was
In fact, he was so humble that
Yeah.
he decided that, let us decide where to meet. We met in a nice coffee shop near our house. And that was like, man, did we come so far? Right?
Yeah.
When did this happen?
Right. No, I would say, in the way I look at it from this perspective on this end, and it was been in conversations with you, Vishnu, where in those first days of you helping this community, building this community, I remember when you went to the university and you were speaking, both you and your brother were talking. You guys, I would say, have been the trailblazers for your community, because now I think now that you have this community, you have this network of people, and now, and I believe that you had said at the point in time when you first started your podcast and we were communicating, you said that podcasting was not a big thing, that it was not that big of a thing in India. And now here we fast forward, and now you're being featured in newspapers, you're being featured on podcasts, you're being featured wherever, maybe universities, wherever. You guys, to me, do you feel like you guys are the trailblazers to this?
I think we very rarely
Humbly?
talk about others.
I mean, to be honest,
I don't know. See, again, as I said, right, we might not admit to it. It could be or it couldn't be. I don't know. We probably are not the best judges.
yeah, most of our listeners don't get back to us too often, so we don't know.
No, I think there is a collective effort for sure. Have we been the people who one of the group that initiated it? Yeah, probably yes. That
Right.
is something that we are really proud of. As we said, we started with a small number of people. I think 2 or 3 of us. Just, hey, you also do podcasting. Let's meet up and talk about what podcasting is all about. That became 5-member team. Next, the week after that, we had around new faces who were like, hey, we want to start. How did you guys do it? And we were not expert. We were like 2 or 3 months into, or maybe 6 months into our journey.
Right.
But we thought, okay, this is what we learned, and this is how you can start, and these are the mistakes that we made, which you could avoid. And 2 years down the line, they're publishing their 100th episodes, they're getting sponsorships, stuff like that. Then we are like, hey, so that did make some difference somewhere.
It sounds like there's just this thirst for podcast knowledge or podcast entertainment in India.
Exactly. See, India, as I said, I think the revolution happened somewhere between 2017 and 2018. If you look at most of the popular podcasts, that would have started around that time, right? Before that, there were podcasts which had started, very popular ones, but that was it. There was
Right.
no community of podcasters or whatever it is.
Right.
But now if you see, we have excellent shows even coming up during this pandemic time who have got recognition and, who have made it big in like 6 months.
Mhm.
And I would say they had a very good foundation. They knew what they're doing, probably because there's a good community here to help out.
Sure.
Yeah. So like when we started, it was a time when we had to like explain, if you want to explain an Android user how to listen to podcasts,
Right.
it was like a 10-step thing. You go to this place, either you go to a website or you download some other app, Pocket Cast or like Castbox, and then you listen to it on that. Over time, the growth was exponential. Like Google Podcast came, then we got podcasts on Spotify, and through that time, when the technological change happened, there were like exponential growth in people who were doing podcasts. So yeah, one major thing which suggests how it changed is like, whenever we used to go for like conducting seminars, earlier it used to be like we used to tell the students podcasting is at its nascent stage. We don't do that anymore.
Right.
And I think one of the things that really contributed to more number of producers coming out is that the listenership has gone up like drastically, right? Even if you take all the major podcasts, let's say Joe Rogan show or anything like that, I think India is one major chunk of, India has a major chunk of listeners for all those shows. People are getting into this culture of listening to podcasts every day while commuting. Even when I used to go to office before this, lockdown happened, the 1 hour commute was the time for me to listen to like 2-3 episodes of my favorite shows, right? So that culture has already started. I think it's maybe 2 or 3 years now, and that increase in number of listeners has created a demand, for local content as well, right? I mean, maybe we might not be able to relate entirely what happens in US, right? Whether it is politics or culture or whatever it is. So you have some shows which start here and talk about Indian culture and Indian politics and all that, which makes sense to them, right? So that created a void, and people have started taking advantage of that. And I'm happy to say that India is emerging as one of the biggest countries in terms of listenership, and as well as people producing podcasts. And that is a really great place to be.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
And just to add on to it, one more thing that we gained through podcasting over the years is like, if we remember correctly, like during the start of the pandemic, right, we had not been podcasting for like 4 months or something. We had like one episode in 4 months. But then once we had like so much time to ourselves, right, we just went ballistic and started the series Colonialism in India and all that. And we got a lot of response from people, whether it being like, saying that your podcast is good, this episode is good, or like asking for some advice on equipment and stuff, how to start a podcast. So it has definitely added some purpose to our life. Podcasting has clearly become a part of our life, which is like bringing some meaning to our life, saying that
right,
at least something, giving back to the community in whatever way possible.
Exactly. And especially in my stream of work in IT, you usually end up spending like 10-12 hours working late nights and stuff like that. This is a way for me to unwind and think that, okay, life is not just about this work. There is something else that I am really interested in, and I invest my time, and that kind of satisfaction, I think you cannot probably put a value to.
Right. So I'm going to explain either in this episode or the next episode, or maybe I've already explained it. Who knows when I'll mention this? But I was in a call yesterday with Edison Research here in the States, and they were doing a top 10 for 2020. And I want to touch on something that you had talked about, Vishnu, where you talked about how when you listen, it's just kind of like a way to release. You just listen because it's like, you could do whatever 10, 12-hour days, but then you come home and you can like listen to a podcast. And that falls directly in line with what some of the research has already said, in saying that people are listening to podcasts when they're either cooking or they're releasing. The average drive time is anywhere between 40 minutes to an hour to go to their jobs in the States, but mostly people are listening when they are taking time to unwind and do what they need to do, whether it be cooking dinner, cleaning, doing laundry, whatever it may be. It just seems to be part of the activity. And now that we are starting to see an increase in smart speaker technology, that is something that is helping the increase in podcast consumption. So we're going to wrap up right there with today's episode, and I want to return on Thursday with part 2 of this episode. So part 1 today, obviously, is the episode where it's telling some podcaster's story, but also sharing a little bit of inspiration to hopefully give you some ideas behind what you can do with your podcast. And maybe you didn't get inspiration from today's episode. That's completely fine. Maybe you just enjoyed the story. That's completely fine. You're going to hear something eventually that is going to spark an idea based on someone else's experience. And that's why I wanted to share Vishnu and Shankar's journey into the podcasting industry and realm itself. So we're going to come back with part 2 of their episode, which I do a speed round of questions with them, and some of them relate to podcasting, and I think a lot of them don't even relate to podcasting, but we dive down this rabbit hole of specific topics, and it really takes on the form of a Writer and Geek podcast itself, and the conversation just kind of goes on and on. So it's going to be a little bit more entertaining for you, so I highly recommend that you listen to it coming up this Thursday. So if you have not subscribed to the podcast, make sure that you do so. Hit the subscribe button if you're on Apple Podcasts. If you're on Spotify, hit the follow button. Wherever you are listening to your podcast, you can go ahead and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And of course, if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, I would really love it. You don't even have to listen on Apple Podcasts. You could just do this on your own. You head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a rating and a review. The reviews help me understand what you, the podcaster, get out of these podcasts and how I could become a better podcaster and create content that really resonates more with you. So I would really appreciate you if you did that. And of course, tomorrow I've got a brand new YouTube video that is going to be dropping for you. So head on over to my YouTube channel. You can just go on over to youtube.com/Shannon Hernandez. That should be able to get you on over there and have you subscribe. But if you don't know, if that's too much for you, just head on over to thepodcasttherapist.com and you can see my entire website where, I have my YouTube channel listed up in the top navigation bar, and that will allow you to go on over there, click and subscribe to the YouTube video itself. So that's going to go ahead and do it for today's Podcast Therapist. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be talking to you on Thursday. Have a great week, everyone. See you.
The Podcast Therapist.
Mixdown Media Productions.